So before we begin, I would just like to shout out my patrons: Dudley Reiner, Nude Banner, Consular, Crimson, Tan, Damarcus Whitewood, and Joanna Rodriguez. I'm very much grateful for your support, and today I actually have a new vlog dropping on Patreon, and if any of you want to support me over there, you can always check the link in the description below.
Hey guys, I'm Naya and welcome back to the channel. So for today's video, I decided to do another archetype breakdown because we haven't done one in a while since there were no other releases than just Tearlament and Sprite stuff and all of that. But now we're slowly approaching Tactical Masters and we have a couple archetypes in there. So for today's video, I decided to break down the Runick archetype and we're gonna talk about the cards, some of the other decks or archetypes I should say that have synergy with it, and a couple counters to the actual deck. So before we get started, please let me know what you think of this video in the comments down below, and actually what you think of this archetype as well, and if you're going to be picking it up or you're a bit weirded out by it, because I certainly am. Basically what Runick is it's an archetype comprised of quick play spell cards for the most part. They are very much reliant on their field spell, because the field spell makes it so you can activate your quick play spell cards from your hand during your opponent's turn as well. So that's a very interesting approach to the actual archetype. But then they have the field spell, they have a continuous spell, and everything else is just quick play spell cards. And then they have no other main deck monsters, which is really interesting. And then moving on to the extra deck, we have a couple fusions that sort of, they feel like this backbone of the strategy. You're kind of reliant on them sort of being there and providing extra protection since you don't have any other monsters to protect you in archetype. So what makes the entire archetype so unique, besides the fact it's only spell cards, it's what those spell cards actually do, because all of them, when it comes to the quick play ones, share a similar effect. I mean, not a similar, it's the same effect. They share the effect of you can special summon their fusion monster to the extra monster zone. And it's no fusion summoning like with actual materials. You just activate the quick play spell card and then you can apply one of the two effects. And one is unique and one is the same among all of them, which is the one to special summon the fusion monster. But it is the sort of restriction that you need to skip your next battle phase. So the next one you would go to, you need to skip it. And actually, to touch upon that a tiny bit more, I'm going to be very brief, but when it comes to skipping phases, you need to keep in mind that you need to actually attempt to move to that phase in order for the phase to be skipped. So you can't like just pretend you skipped it without think you skipped it without actually trying to enter it. Because if you make that mistake and you don't actually say, okay, I'm trying to enter the battle phase, it's getting skipped right now due to my effect, and then you move on to the end phase and all of that. If you don't do that, the game, now this is going to be a weird wording, but the game sort of forces you to skip the next one because you didn't really attempt to enter it, so you never skipped it. So yeah, hopefully this wording isn't too confusing, because in theory the game doesn't force you to do anything. It's quite the opposite, but you know what I mean. When it comes to these effects, you need to keep that in mind. So then we ask ourselves, how would an archetype like this actually work? So yeah, you summon those fusion monsters, but what do they really do? Since you need to summon them to the extra monster zone, if you don't somehow remove it, you can't summon another one to the extra monster zone, of course, since you can only occupy one and then one is reserved for your opponent as per the game rules. So how the archetype actually works is you have another effect, which I mentioned. You have a unique effect on every single one of the spell cards. And usually those effects are going to be some kind of disruption. So you have a destruction of spell trap, destruction of monster, a Veiler impermanence type of effect. So those sort of basic things, but then they have another part to that effect. So the sort of goal of this archetype is going to be to actually deck out the opponent, which might seem a bit weird. And it might seem a bit sort of mystic mind burn-esque, if you know what I mean. It's this weird win condition, and I can't say I'm completely on board with it. Please let me know what you think in the comments. But I think the archetype is still really interesting to talk about. But if you're totally down to deck out your opponent, I mean, sure, you do you. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're actually able to banish some really important combo pieces from the top of your opponent's deck, like an important one-off or, like I said, a combo piece or some kind of extender that they need, you're not only taking resources away from them, but you're sort of preventing them to go for their regular plays if you're getting rid of their cards. And with all of that being said, we're going to get into the card by card breakdown, and we're going to talk about the entire archetype. Alright, so the first card is going to be Runick Fountain. Now, another quick thing to keep in mind, this archetype used to be roughly translated to Mr. Rune, and right now it's going to be called Runick. So if you hear any of these words, you know that it's basically talking about the same thing, but we are going to be calling this Runick here in the TCG. So the first one is going to be Runick Fountain, and it's the field spell that I mentioned, and basically it says that you can activate Runick quick play spell cards from your hand during the opponent's turn, and it has another effect. It's just a once per turn, it's not a hard once per turn, and it's also not limited to you only activating one field spell. You can activate as many as you want, and that's something to keep in mind because the entire focus of this archetype is going to be looping the second portion of the field spell's effect. And what it says is that you can target up to 3 quick play spell cards in your graveyard. It's not with different names, so keep that in mind as well. There are legit no limitations when it comes to this archetype. Like, naturally, they need to be Runick quick play spell cards, but that's the only limitation. So you can target up to 3 of them, place them on the bottom of the deck in any order, and draw that many cards. So if you're able to get into the loop of activating multiple field spells, and then you can actually draw a lot of cards consequentially. But when you activate this effect, it actually needs to be when you activate a Runick quick play spell card. So it's not just during the main phase, but it's like if you activate the Runick quick play spell card, then on like resolution, when a new chain is built, it's going to be the field spell effect activating, and then you're able to place on the bottom and draw. And why that's also important is since it is a trigger effect, when you activated the quick play spell card that you activated before, it's going to be in the graveyard already. So you are most definitely drawing at least 1 card, but probably you are going to be able to have access to more, sometimes even 3. And when I did test hands, like, the deck just draws an insane amount of cards if you're actually focusing on the field spell. Now, the next one is going to be Runick Allure. It's the continuous spell card, and you can only control 1 of it. And each time a quick play spell card activates, you banish the top card of your opponent's deck. It's mandatory, and it's not just a Runick quick play spell card, so that's also something to keep in mind. Alright, so we're just going to go through one of the spells when it comes to the second effect, so you have a bit of an idea how they are worded. So basically, first it says that you can activate one of these effects, but then you need to skip your next battle phase after activation. And then the second effect that's the same among all of them basically just says that you can special summon a Runick monster from your extra deck to the extra monster zone. And all of the spell cards are hard once per turns. Now this one, Runick Tip, has the first effect, which is unique, and it says that you can add a Runick card from your deck to your hand, and then you can banish the top card of your opponent's deck. So this one only banishes 1, and is basically the deck's searcher. Then we have Runick Flashing Fire, and unique effect says that you can destroy one of your opponent's special summon monsters, then banish 2 cards from the top of their deck. And something to keep in mind as well is the fact that the banishing portion is like part of the effect. It's not a you can banish, you just always will banish top cards of your opponent's deck as well as activating like the other part of the effect. Then we have Runick Destruction, and it targets a spell or trap card of your opponent and then banishes top 4 cards of your opponent's deck. And then we have Runick Dispelling, which says if your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can randomly discard one of their cards from the hand and banish top 2 cards from their deck. Runick Freezing Curses is basically a Veiler, and it just says that you target one of your opponent's effect monsters and negate the effects until the end of the turn, and also banish top 3 cards from their deck. And then we have Runick Slumber, and it says that you target a face-up monster on the field, and the first time this card will be destroyed by battle or card effect this turn, it's not, and also it cannot attack this turn, and then you banish the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. Then we have Runick Droplet, and it says that your opponent draws 1 card, and then you banish top 4 cards of their deck. So you get rid of 5 cards, but it's still you giving them cards, which is kind of odd for a card effect, but I guess we've seen a couple of these cards in the past, so this one shouldn't come off as that much a surprise, especially in a deck like this. Then we have Runick Smiting Storm, which says that you banish the top cards of your opponent's deck up to the number of cards they control. Alright, then we have 4 fusion monsters, but 3 of these are going to be released in Tactical Masters, and one of them is actually from Darkwing Blast. So this one is not coming to the TCG yet, but we're going to cover all of them. So first, we have the level 2 fusion, which is Hugin the Runick Wings, and it's probably the most important monster of the archetype. So it says that if this card is special summoned from the extra deck, you can discard 1 card and search for a copy of the Runick field spell. So that's how you get access to it. If you already drew 1 copy, then immediately you're looping 2, and that's how you go on and do these things, because none of these effects, when it comes to the fusion monsters, as you're going to be able to see, is not once per turn. So however many times you summon, you can actually use their effects as well. And then it also says that if a card or cards you control would be destroyed by card effect, you can actually banish this card from the field instead. And if this card was destroyed by battle or card effect, you can you return it, so it's mandatory, return it to the extra deck. And then we have Moonin the Runick Wings, and if it's special summoned, it searches, you discard 1 card, and it searches a Runick continuous spell card. And then when your opponent targets a Runick card or cards, or a set card you control, quick effect, you can banish this card from your field, or this card you control, I should say, and you can negate the activation and also destroy it. And then once per turn, during the end phase, you gain 1000 life points. Now we have Gary the Runick Fangs, and it says that it cannot be destroyed by card effects, and it also says that if this card is special summoned, you can add from your graveyard 1 non-quick play Runick spell card. So that's how you sort of are getting the idea at this point, I think, that you can recycle the field spell because it's non-quick play. So if you already have a copy and then you search another one with the level 2 fusion, so the Hugin, and then you can add it back with Gary again. And if you have even more quick play spell cards to activate, you're going to be able to draw an insane amount of cards, and it's a lot of card advantage. Like when we were doing those test hands, it just seemed insane to me how much cards the deck is actually able to draw, like naturally, if you're not disrupted. And then Gary also says that when this card is destroyed by battle, you can destroy 1 card on the field. All right, and then we have Freki the Runick Fangs. I'm going to call it Freki. It's how I would call it here in my language. So probably it's not how it's supposed to be pronounced, but it's the card from Darkwing Blast. And so it says when an attack is declared involving this card in the extra monster zone, you can banish the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. And also neither player actually takes battle damage from attacks involving this card. And if this card was to be destroyed by battle or card effect, and this is the only hard once per turn on their fusion monsters, you can target a Runick quick play spell card in your graveyard and add it to your hand. All right, and then we're just going to quickly go over how the deck sort of looks like once you actually build it, and a couple of engines or decks you can play with it, from stuff I found from like Roto the King, or just things that I think might work and I've seen on the internet. It's not entirely like my ideas, but it's just a couple things that I've seen people build and they make a lot of sense. So I wanted to bring all of this info to you. And then to round this video off, we're also going to just quickly mention a couple, I guess, downsides of the deck and also counters to it. So looking at the deck, we sort of made, like on Dueling Book, just a rough version when we were testing. And I think the 3 copies of Field Spell, of course, is like mandatory if you're going for like a very turbo heavy, just almost pure Runick deck. It can be played in different versions, but this one is like, I guess to me, the most interesting because it's actually like focused on banishing cards of your opponent and just going through your quick play spells and of course your field spell as much as possible. So then you have almost everything else at 3. Just a couple of these we put to like 2 because we didn't deem them that strong or important when it comes to the disruption that they provide, and like 1 copy of the continuous one since it's searchable if you really want it or need it. And then now here we have a couple of things that might work. So during testing, we actually made this deck together with Fabled. So when you look at Fabled stuff, you have the Fabled Abank, which is the level 2 tuner, and then again the Fabled Cerbula, which is also the level 2 tuner. And how they sort of synergize is when you go to Hugin, which is the first level 2 fusion monster, and then you get one of these, you're immediately going to be able to sync off. And then if you get to the blue one and you maybe discard any other card, or the red one preferably, you can special summon it back, and then since it gets banished, but it doesn't really matter since you go on with all of your synchro plays and then get the red one and continue. And like while testing, we realized that it's quite easily accessible to get to something like Cupid Pitch, like immediately get to the blue one since it has 600 defense, and Cupid Pitch, when it's synced off, it searches a monster with 600 defense. And since you can manipulate the levels, then you're able to get to something like Chaos Ruler. And then you have your standard level 6 synchros, which of course one of them tuner, one of them non-tuner, depending on what you might need in that situation. And then you're able to get to Baron, and you're able to get to Changying. And since you are going to be banishing cards, Changying immediately becomes a very strong disruption, so you're quite easily able to go into these cards. So it's like some sort of monster presence you have on top of everything else. So I think it's a cool addition, and it's what we've been testing the most, but we have a couple other options. So first, here in the side, I just put Demise of the Land and Mystic Mine because I wanted to indicate that you're able to put some of these cards in because you have that much draw power. So it's the sort of, I guess, board breaking card you can play, you can run if it's the kind of meta that you're sort of going into, because you're going to be able to draw into it. So there's that. It's just basically it's just an idea. And then we have Reasoning and Monster Gate as well. So we tested this, and it's kind of insane. You mill a lot of cards and you get to a lot of different cards in your hand because of looping of the field spells. So if you're going for like a turbo version, I think that's a cool addition. And then I wanted to touch upon Magical Musketeer. I have not personally tested this version yet, but I've been theorizing, and I think it's very interesting since you are able to play your stuff from your hand to be able to then trigger the Magical Musketeers. So yeah, I mean, I guess it could work. I just wanted to bring this sort of idea forward. And then we also have Gigantic Sprite here, indicating the Sprite version, because in OCG, if we look at the most recent Road of the King report, actually 2 decks managed with Sprite Runick to get some decent results. So Sprite naturally is a splashable engine. It's not that big, so you're able to include it together with something like this. Now, overall, to me, how Runick feels, not to spend too much time, but it feels a bit gimmicky with the banishing, and you need to skip your battle phase, so you are sort of relying on other ways of winning, which is just a tiny bit too slow or just maybe weird to me. I still think it's interesting, but if you're actually looking at something like Sprite, at that point, if you invest in this Sprite, you might be pairing this up with something else, but I guess it is still a version because the Huggin is level 2, so immediately there's synergy there, and you're able to go on to Gigantic Sprite and do all of your other plays. And then also Sky Striker would definitely be a deck that comes to mind, simply because you have all of these spells but no monster presence, and if you have if you mash it up with Sky Striker things, you have monster presence and you have a ton of spells in the graveyard for engage draws and for every other effect of the Sky Striker spells to go through completely to actually get the full advantage out of it. So I think that's also interesting. And then as the last 2 monsters here, we just put the Fabled Synchros, since they are good additions if you're going for the Fabled route, but specifically the Fabled Unicorn is interesting because basically you negate the cards and effects your opponent activates while you and your opponent have the same number of cards in hand. So if you're able to achieve that, I think it's really interesting. You're able to summon it quite easily, but from what we found from testing, you would probably rather climb into some other synchro monsters. So yeah, I guess that's it when it comes to the actual deck and a couple of things you can play with it. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of different options, and I maybe only scratched the surface. So if you have any other ideas, any kind of suggestions, I would love to read that in the comments. And then to just quickly round everything off, I already touched upon it a bit. When it comes to Runick, it's interesting. It's very unique. But there are a couple cards that completely counter it, making it a bit more fragile. Because if you look at, for example, in Tactical Masters, we're actually getting Invader of Darkness reprints. So that's immediately a very important counter to the deck. And then you look at cards like Anti-Spell Fragrance, or even Eradicator Epidemic Virus, being a very heavily spell-reliant archetype, immediately it makes it prone to disruption in that sort of form. And then the last thing would maybe be the fact that you are so field spell reliant. Now, if you don't set your quick play spell cards, since you can activate them from the hand, naturally you're not that prone to a big blowout card like Lightning Storm or Evenly or things like that. But in theory, if your actual field spell gets disrupted or like completely just leaves the field, then you're sort of left with almost an empty field if you don't have some kind of disruption set or some kind of monster backbone. So being so reliant on a specific card that's easily prone to destruction, I don't know, it's making it even more fragile in my eyes, because you're not always going to be ending, at least I think, on the Huggin to be able to protect the field spell. Or I guess if you are, then that's something to keep in mind while you are playing. So overall your field might end up being a bit worse since you're just leaving the Huggin to be able to protect the field spell. So it's a couple things to like keep in mind, and I'm sure a lot more theories should go into this moving forward from the entire player base, because I'm so excited to see what people actually come up with such an interesting and specific archetype. So yeah, I think that's going to be rounding this video off. And yeah, hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you found it interesting. And let me know what you think of it in the comments. I would really love to hear that. And please, if you liked it, of course, like it and sub to the channel. Check out all the social media. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.